Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. Your ongoing study in Jürgen Moltmann and the Work of Hope, edited by Professor Doug Meeks of Vanderbilt Divinity School in Memphis. We're going to look at pages 85 to 93, essay number 7 by Jennings on the listening subject. Let's begin with block 1. And we'll look at the word as word of liberation. We hope for the emergence of a new subjectivity, redefining anthropos with reference to a wider venue, defining man's new way of being in the world. So this new way of being in the world, it requires a new listening subject who listens to life-changing lessons through an expanded epistemology that reaches beyond the history of the powerful West. In other words, decolonial thinking, says Jennings. So anthropos, redefined and beyond the history of the West, equals a decolonial thinking concerning human identity. It's listening to the minority voice and positing liberation from the political arrangement of power that currently exists, promoting the goal of each person being able to control their own humanity, allowing the Word of God to become Word of liberation, which requires transformation of theological work. Now, it might seem strange to be talking about liberation theology here after we've already passed that era of the theology of liberation, but we are putting together essays honoring Moltmann, and Moltmann anticipated the theology of liberation with his book, The Crucified God, with the theology of hope as far as that's concerned, but that is why Jennings has taken on this subject. Let's go to block 2, the God who listens and the listening subject. Transformative theological work. The process of listening leads to new sign formations of being in the world by taking up the voice of the oppressed and the voice of the abandoned. So we're taking up advocacy for the oppressed as a gesture toward true universality, seeing creation as a redemptive order for all, an all-inclusive redemptive order within the life of God, within the context of sin and salvation. So concretely, we're looking at a universal redemptive order. Moltmann offers a new possibility for the listening subject, one who listens for a new self-understanding and a new self-identity. Moltmann had to synthesize Reformation theology with German war guilt in order to find that voice for the abandoned in his theology, and to find that voice in the gospel, which he did. So theoretically, we learned in block 1 that the author says we need to posit a decolonial thinking of true liberation theology. The Word of God needs to become Word of liberation. Concretely, that means block 2, note 4, the listening subject and theology confronted by concrete guilt. God had a history with Auschwitz that goes beyond victim and perpetrator. Toward new earth and new righteousness, suffering must alter our theological thought. Oppression, suffering, abandonment must alter our theological thought. We must perceive the God who listens. We must perceive the God who listens and who knows the suffering of creation. So concretely, we take that word of liberation and we make it apply in a concrete way to actual victims of the suffering within creation. And that takes us to our final theological triad in block 3, which will consist of the God who listens the voice that cries out, and theology as praxis. Like I say, even though we're familiar with liberation theology, this is a recapitulation of that transition that did take place in an anticipated way by Jürgen Moltmann and his theology of hope, which led to the crucified God. So let's look at this final triad. Suffering alters our course of thought. Our communion with suffering has God as third interlocutor. We're involved in a threefold conversation, moving toward redemption. Our voice, the voice of the oppressed, and the voice of God as the word of liberation. This conversation takes place through new understanding, new seeing, and new hearing. Now the voice that cries out, we listen, learn, and seek to speak in alignment with a groaning world, allowing the outcast to collaborate with our theological vision and our praxis project. We start taking up the political side of theology in a reflective and active, concrete way. Therefore, we're talking about theology as praxis in 3:3. And just as a reminder, I'll give you the definition for the Greek concept of praxis. It's action and reflection within a concrete, particular historical situation. Action and reflection in a particular, concrete historical situation. Therefore, theology can never be separated from the political. Moltmann's political inside the theological is what he posited. Moltmann posited the political inside the theological. Theological work that lays bare its political implications. And those political implications make up the movement of spirit of the newly born listening subject that listens in a new way, that listens to the conversation, the threefold conversation of the theologian with the abandoned and the word of liberation from the gospel. A threefold conversation. Word of liberation, word of theologian, word of the oppressed. All come together in our new theology for the new listening subject. And we know that gave birth to a book by Gustavo Gutierrez called The Gospel of Liberation. Liberation Theology. Moltmann responded with a book called The Crucified God, which he wrote to correct America's misinterpretation of his theology of hope, America's overly optimistic, non-political interpretation of his theology of hope. He wrote The Crucified God to correct that non-praxis, non-political interpretation. It was already in the theology of hope, but America read over it. We're reminded of that step in Moltmann's theology by Professor Jennings on the listening subject, and excellent presentation here, really. The theoretical block 1 taught us that we redefine the concept of anthropos. We go beyond the history of the West. We take up decolonial thinking, and by doing so, the gospel is the Word of God becoming Word of liberation. The Word of God becomes Word of liberation. Concretely, we have an example of Jürgen Moltmann himself, who confronted Auschwitz, and who could never be the same theologian again, because he saw that God had a history with Auschwitz toward a new earth, a new righteousness, and that theological thought must be altered by this horror of Auschwitz. Theology must be altered. Because the God who listens is a God who knows the suffering of creation, the suffering of the victims, the suffering of the oppressed, the suffering of Auschwitz, the horror of Auschwitz. That then took us, after that concrete step in block 2, that took us to the final triad. The God who listens confronts the voice that cries out of the abandoned. That leads the listening subject, the theologian as listening subject, to take up a theology of praxis, action and reflection within a particular concrete historical situation, of taking up the voice of the abandoned, taking up the voice of the oppressed, taking up the voice of the outcast, and entering into a conversation with the gospel as word of liberation. Doing that is transformative. Doing that is liberating theology, liberating human identity, liberating the concept anthropos. It takes us full circle back to block 1. Excellent essay, really well done, to bring together the theoretical, the concrete, and then our conclusive triad of the God who listens, the voice that cries out, theology as praxis, as liberating praxis. We do take up a theology that addresses a particular action and reflection in a particular concrete historical situation. We act in the midst of mission. We reflect on the word of liberation and the new unfolding of the promise of God in history. We re-internalize that new unveiling, which involves a new imprinting of the heart with the person of Jesus Christ, which informs our Sophia wisdom, which informs our Gnosis wisdom, which informs our praxis ministry, and we go out of the self in praxis toward the abandoned, more mature, more maturely informed, more maturely convicted, more maturely motivated to stand for a human identity and a historical identity that takes up the voice of the oppressed, the voice of the outcast, the voice of those abandoned, taken up in the cry of Jesus, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Those oppressed are taken up in that cry of abandonment, promised as overcome in the resurrection. That is why we can say with Professor Jennings that we must become the new listening subject. We must become a new listening subject who reads and listens to the Word of God as a word of liberation for those unlike the privileged, for those unlike the powerful, for those unlike the West, for those not in that position of privilege and benefit and power, who cry out with their voice, asking to be recognized as human, asking for an identity of their own, asking for the ability to control their own humanity. Concretely, Moltmann discovered this when confronting the concrete guilt of World War II in Germany and the harsh horror of Auschwitz. He had to get beyond victim and perpetrator. He had to discover the promise of new heaven and new earth. He had to discover the promise of new righteousness for all creation. new righteousness for all humanity. And theology had to be altered. Moltmann concluded that theology must be altered. And he did that in his Theology of Hope. America read over it and came up with a utopian optimism that was a misreading of the Theology of Hope. Moltmann had to correct that with his book, The Crucified God, and that was very much in alignment with Gutierrez and his liberation theology. That's why Jennings rightly points out the final triad has to be concluding with theology as liberating praxis. Wonderfully done essay, very well done, on the listening subject by W.J. Jennings, pages 85 to 93. We're going to pick up next time on essay number 8, which will be our penultimate essay.